I saw her speak on the phone, that voice that used to be sweet but now carried an urgency I'd never noticed. "I'm going to find you now." The tone was direct, decisive. My heart froze. I was there, standing, listening to my own wife arrange a meeting, and it wasn't me. My head spun, the ground seemed missing beneath my feet, but some strength, some need to know, pushed me to follow her. She left hurriedly, trying not to arouse suspicion, but I knew her too well not to notice the nervousness in every gesture. And so, I followed her through the streets of Boston, feeling the biting cold of autumn pierce my skin like knives, but nothing hurt as much as the certainty that was growing in me. She drove in a hurry, ignoring red lights, as if every second separating her from that encounter was an unbearable eternity. And I, suffocated by anger and pain, followed her, a part of me still wishing I was wrong. Maybe it was a mistake, a coincidence, but the truth seemed more and more inevitable. When she stopped, my heart almost stopped with it. It was a discreet restaurant, one of those places where people go to hide from prying eyes. She walked in with a smile on her face, a smile I hadn't seen in a long time. I waited a few minutes before getting out of the car, trying to find a way to breathe, trying to calm the storm inside me. I needed to see it with my own eyes. Maybe, seeing it, I could understand, maybe there would be some explanation for the inexplicable. I entered the restaurant, and there she was, sitting at the table, as if she was waiting for something. Or someone. And then, he arrived. I couldn't see her face, but I saw how she stood up, and how her arms wrapped around him in a hug I hadn't received in a long time. The intimacy in the gesture, the way their bodies seemed to fit together, it broke something inside me. It was like watching my own life fall apart in slow motion. "I can't hide this anymore," she said, her voice low enough for me to hear. "I need you." Those words ripped through my chest. How could she say that? For him. For a moment, I thought about leaving, but I didn't. I needed to see how far this would go, needed to feel the full extent of the betrayal. So I stayed. Later, when she came home, I tried to maintain control, to act as if nothing had happened. Her face seemed lit up, as if she had just experienced a happiness that hadn't existed between us for a long time. And I knew I needed to speak. I needed to understand. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed the calm I was pretending to be. I just left to run some errands," she replied, looking away. I didn't say anything else that night, but the decision had already been made. I would end this. Days later, I gathered my courage and filed for divorce. I told her I knew everything, and her expression, her surprise, her attempt to deny it, made me feel deeply sick. "It can't be true," she said, as if this were a nightmare she wanted to wake up from. But I was awake, and more lucid than ever. Finally, she admitted it. And I thought it would end there. That the pain would dissipate with that confession, but I was wrong. That night, alone in our room, I realized that the betrayal had taken root too deeply. The emptiness was suffocating. And then an idea came to me, something I couldn't have imagined before. I wanted to know who he was. I wanted to know what he had that I didn't have. Maybe, deep down, I needed to understand why all this happened. So, I started looking for answers. That's when everything changed. I discovered things I never imagined about her. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was a conspiracy that involved more than I could understand. My wife was being influenced, manipulated. And it wasn't just him, the lover, who was behind it. There was another person, an older shadow, closer than I might have suspected. Someone who, from the beginning, never wanted our marriage to work. Someone who pushed her towards him, who encouraged her to find another path, to plan a life without me, away from everything we built together. This betrayal had deep roots, and I was only scratching the surface. The pieces began to fall into place, each discovery taking me deeper into a web of lies and manipulation. And at the center of it all, there was her, the woman I loved, and who now seemed like a stranger. She said it was a mistake, but I knew it was more than that. It was a choice. But did she make this choice alone? Or did someone guide her, whispering what she wanted to hear, promising her an easier, happier future? I could no longer ignore what I knew. And with every step I took, more questions arose. Did she still love me? Did you ever love? And who was the real mastermind behind all this? Because deep down, she knew her lover was just a piece in a bigger game. And I needed to find out who was moving these pieces. Because while she said she was ready for a divorce, while she looked at me with those eyes full of tears that no longer moved me, I knew she was hiding something. Something she didn't want me to find out. But I would find out. What started as a simple betrayal turned into a game of manipulations, lies and secrets. I thought I knew my wife, but the truth was that she was hiding a whole world from me. A world that I was about to unmask, whatever the cost. And as I prepared myself to face that truth, a question kept ringing in my mind: how far would someone go to hide a betrayal? And perhaps, the answer was darker and more unexpected than I was prepared to face. Welcome to our channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry a powerful truth: betrayal destroys lives, hearts, and homes. Each tale is a reminder of how bad decisions can lead to devastating consequences. So, get ready, because now you're going to dive into a shocking, intense story full of twists and turns. Enjoy! John looked at his watch for the third time as he straightened his tie in front of the mirror. Mornings at the Smith house were always chaotic, full of hurried conversations, coffee cups crossing the kitchen, and low laughter that echoed down the hallway. But that day, there was a silence that bothered him. Mary, his wife, was more distant than usual. He tried to ignore it. Maybe it was tiredness. After all, they had both faced difficult weeks. She, with her projects at the art gallery, and he, in the endless work meetings. John was a methodical man, someone who found comfort in routine. As a lawyer at a prestigious firm, he had built a solid career and a respected name. He was the type of person who planned every detail of his day, from his office appointments to the peaceful nights he spent at home. John liked to think he had control over his life, that his marriage to Mary was solid despite the normal difficulties any couple faces after more than a decade together. Deep down, I believed that small crises, arguments and even distances that arose from time to time were normal. For him, everything could be resolved with conversation and a little patience. Mary, on the other hand, was a free-spirited artist. His eyes always shone when talking about his paintings, the vibrant colors he chose to bring his ideas to life. She had turned the garage into a studio, and spent hours there, lost in her own world, which John never seemed to be able to enter. When they met, still in college, it was precisely this passion that captivated him. She was intense, determined and full of life, a flame that he feared would go out with time, but that until then seemed inextinguishable. However, in recent months, Mary seemed less herself. There was a weight in his eyes, a hesitation in the smiles that were once spontaneous and warm. Their lives had changed a lot since their college days. They had built a comfortable house, a home that reflected their personalities, John's quiet organization and Mary's chaotic creativity. In the room, there was a painting she painted, an abstract work that John never fully understood, but that he loved because it was a piece of who Mary was. For him, that painting was a symbol of what they had built together, something unique, with its own imperfections and beauty. But recently, that work of art seemed out of place, as if it no longer fit in the house. And it wasn't just the painting. Mary was also out of place, a little absent. John tried to convince himself that it was just a phase, that everyone had moments of introspection, especially someone like her, whose soul seemed deeper and more complex than his. However, there was something he couldn't ignore, a nagging feeling that something was wrong. That morning, as he finished getting ready for work, Mary walked into the kitchen, a little tidier than usual for a regular Wednesday. Her hair was tied up in a loose bun, and she was wearing a dress he hadn't seen in a while. John watched her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. She looked radiant, but there was a subtle restlessness in her movements. "Do you have any appointments today?" he asked, casually, trying to sound unconcerned. She hesitated for a moment before responding, as if choosing her words carefully. "Yes, I have some things to take care of at the gallery," she said, smiling quickly before looking away. "And then I'm going to meet my mom for lunch." John nodded, accepting the explanation without question. It was not uncommon for her to have last-minute meetings or spontaneous get-togethers with her family. But even so, there was something in her voice that made him uncomfortable. John left for work, but the image of Mary did not leave him. He found himself thinking about her during a meeting, an unusual distraction for someone as focused as he was. He remembered the times she laughed when he told him about a new project or when she dragged him to exhibitions that he didn't understand, but loved because he saw how much it meant to her. Now, those laughs were rarer, and so were the invitations to go out together. In turn, Mary felt suffocated. Marriage had become a predictable routine, something that made her feel trapped. There were days when everything seemed right, and she could lose herself in her paintings, forgetting the doubts that tormented her. But in others, she felt empty, as if she were living a life that was no longer hers. She knew John loved her, it was never a question. He was dedicated, kind and always did his best to please her. But she began to realize that his love wasn't enough to fill the emptiness growing inside her. It was difficult for Mary to admit this, even to herself. Why were you feeling this way? Why, even with everything they had achieved together, did she still feel like something was missing? These questions echoed in her mind, and she tried to suffocate them with work, with occasional outings, with anything that would distract her from that oppressive feeling of dissatisfaction. The art gallery, once a source of joy, now felt more like an obligation, a place I went just to escape home. That afternoon, Mary walked into the studio and looked at the blank screen in front of her. The colors that used to call her, that made her want to create something new, were muted. She picked up the brush, but her hands hesitated. There was a storm in her mind, a whirlwind of emotions that she didn't know how to put on paper. Suddenly, the cell phone vibrated. She looked at the screen and a message appeared, something that made her heart race. John came home that night and found Mary on the couch, a glass of wine in her hand. She smiled when she saw him, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. They had dinner together, talked about the day, and he tried, once again, to pull her close, trying to light that flame that seemed to be slowly going out. "We should do something this weekend," he suggested. "Get out, go somewhere different." "Of course," she replied, but there was a hesitation, an uncertainty that he couldn't decipher. John wanted to believe that this was a problem they could solve, that Mary just needed a little more time, a little more space. But the truth was, he didn't know what to do to bring her back to him. And that made him increasingly restless. Thus, the two continued their routines, like two strangers who shared the same space, but lived in separate worlds. John didn't know that emptiness he felt in conversations, in silent nights, was a harbinger of something much bigger. Something that wouldn't be resolved with a weekend away or an honest conversation. Because, unbeknownst to him, greater forces were working to push them away, forces he had no way of controlling. Time seemed to slip by slowly, as John tried to deal with the feeling of loss that accompanied him each day. He threw himself into work, seeking in the frenetic office routine a relief from the anxiety that was growing within him, but even there, the image of Mary would not leave his head. She continued to be everything he thought he was, even when he tried to convince himself that it was just a phase, something they would get over. Still, the distance between the two seemed to grow, and he didn't know how to reach it. John began to notice small changes in Mary's behavior. She was increasingly absent, her excuses to leave the house became more frequent, and her answers became evasive. "I have a meeting at the gallery," she said, but there was something in her voice, an intonation he didn't recognize. She became more impatient, irritable, as if she were constantly on the edge of an abyss that he couldn't see. One night, while Mary was taking a shower, John noticed that her cell phone was unlocked on the table. He hesitated, feeling torn between guilt and fear, but curiosity got the better of him. He didn't want to be that kind of husband, the one who spies on his wife's phone, but the feeling that something was wrong was suffocating. With shaking hands, he slid his finger across the screen, searching for anything that could explain her behavior. His heart skipped a beat when he saw a series of messages exchanged with an unknown number. Simple words, but full of intimacy: "I can't wait to see you, I miss you." John felt a lump form in his throat, and before he could read any further, he heard Mary turning off the shower. He quickly returned the phone to where it was, pretending to be distracted by his cell phone when she entered the room. That night he barely slept. The image of the messages repeated in his mind, like a scene from a movie he didn't want to watch, but couldn't stop watching. Had he misunderstood? Could there be an explanation for that? Every time he tried to find an excuse, a reason not to believe what he saw, the doubt gnawed at him a little more. Over the next few days, John began to watch Mary more closely, looking for signs he didn't want to find. She seemed lighter, almost happy, which only made his pain grow. How could she smile while he felt like everything was falling apart? But he still didn't have the courage to confront her. What if he was wrong? What if it was just a misunderstanding that could destroy everything? He decided to wait, watch, until he was sure. And then, one Friday afternoon, something unexpected happened. John left work early, an attempt to surprise Mary and perhaps remove that feeling of distance that separated them. As he was driving home, he saw something that made his heart stop. Mary's car was parked on a street he knew well but had no reason to be on. It was an inconspicuous restaurant that he vaguely recognized, and Mary was there, standing in front of the entrance, looking at her cell phone. He slowed down, watching from afar, trying to understand what she was doing there. A few minutes later, a man appeared. He smiled at her, and Mary smiled back, a smile he hadn't seen in a long time, a smile that was his alone, or at least it should be. John watched in silence as Mary approached the man and hugged him, a hug that lasted a little longer than it should have. They walked into the restaurant together, laughing at something he couldn't hear, and in that moment, John felt something inside him break. He parked the car a safe distance away and for a moment thought about leaving. Maybe it would be better to pretend that you didn't see, that you didn't know. But anger and despair took over. He needed to see, needed to be sure of what his eyes had already confirmed. He entered the restaurant, keeping to the shadows, watching as Mary and the man sat at a secluded table, almost hidden from everyone's view. They laughed, spoke quietly, and each gesture felt like a stab at John. She touched the man's hand, and her eyes sparkled in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. John couldn't hear what they were saying, but he didn't need to. The betrayal was there, evident in every gesture, in every smile. Mary was with another man, and there was no denying it. He stood there, watching, unable to move, as if he were trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. When he finally forced himself to leave the restaurant, he felt his legs get heavy, his heart beating so hard that it felt like it was going to tear his chest apart. He didn't know how he got back into the car, but somehow he drove to a nearby park and sat there, trying to understand how it had happened. How had the love he thought was solid fallen apart without him realizing it? The pain was suffocating, but with it came the need for answers. John knew that the betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg, that there was something deeper hidden behind that encounter. He still didn't know what, but he was determined to find out. And as night fell, he felt that a part of himself, a part that he had always trusted, that had always believed in Mary, was dying. John spent the weekend immersed in a kind of torpor, a suffocating mix of pain and anger. He couldn't get the image out of his head of Mary and the other man, together in the restaurant, laughing and touching like lovers. The betrayal he had discovered was a deep blow, but the feeling of perplexity was even greater. How had he been so blind? What else was hiding beneath the surface of their marriage? In the days that followed, John began to observe Mary with an attention that she did not notice. He didn't confront, he didn't ask questions. He just waited, like a hunter hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. Her every movement, her every smile was an enigma that he tried to decipher. And then, something unexpected happened. One phone call changed everything. One Tuesday morning, as John was leaving for work, Mary received a call that made her face change expression. She looked at her cell phone and, for a moment, hesitated to answer it. John, watching from afar, noticed the nervousness in her gestures. "I need to answer it," she said, walking away to the office, closing the door behind her. That was unusual. John knew something important was happening, and that's when he made the decision to listen to what Mary was trying to hide. He approached the office and put his ear to the door. Mary's voice was low, almost a whisper. "I know, I'm already taking care of it." "Yes, he still doesn't know," she said, in an urgent tone. John couldn't hear everything, but one sentence in particular caught his attention, a sentence that made his blood run cold. "I spoke to my mother, and she said she's going to help us. She always wanted this." That sentence swirled through John's mind like a tornado. Mary's mother? He had never imagined that she could be involved. Throughout their marriage, she had been distant, cold, but never hostile. On the contrary, she had always maintained a cordial attitude towards him. John went back to his car and sat there, trying to process the information. What did that mean? It was then that he realized he needed answers, and decided that the best way to get them was to directly confront those who seemed to be at the center of it all. Not Mary, but the woman who, for so many years, he believed was just on the periphery of their lives, her mother. That afternoon, after getting off work, John decided to drive to his mother-in-law's house. His heart was pounding as he parked in the driveway. He didn't know what he expected to find, but he knew he needed to face it head-on. When she opened the door, she seemed surprised but not shocked. "John, what a surprise. I didn't expect you here today," she said, with a smile that seemed rehearsed. "I didn't expect to be here either," he replied, trying to remain calm even though inside he was boiling. "But I need to talk to you. Now." She frowned, but gave him room to enter. The house was exactly as he remembered, spotless, cold, without a trace of personality. He sat in the room, while she remained standing, as if she was waiting for something. John watched her for a few moments, looking for any trace that gave away her intentions, but she remained impassive. "I know Mary is cheating on me," he said, breaking the silence with a direct blow. He waited for some reaction, but her expression remained calm, almost bored. "And I know you had something to do with it." For a moment, she just stared at him, and then let out a short, cold laugh. Ah, John, always so naive. So predictable. He felt a shiver run down his spine. Her voice carried a contempt he had never noticed before. "What's going on here?" he insisted, trying to keep his voice steady. "Why are you involved in this?" She sighed and sat down on the chair in front of him, crossing her legs with an air of superiority. "Did you really think this marriage would last forever, John? That Mary was satisfied with this boring life you offered her?" The words left his mouth with a biting coldness. "From the beginning, I knew you weren't the right man for her. And I did what I could to ensure she had a better life." John was speechless. Her confession was something he could never have imagined. Did you encourage this?" He could hardly believe what he was hearing. "Did you encourage your own daughter to betray me?" She laughed again, this time longer and almost sarcastic. "Did I encourage it? I planned. Mary needed someone more ambitious, someone who could offer the life I always wanted for her. And you were just a mistake, a phase we needed to overcome." John felt like he had been punched in the stomach. Her words were merciless, raw, and each one felt like a stab. "How can you do this? Manipulate your own daughter, ruin our marriage?" He couldn't contain the tone of indignation in his voice. And who is this man? Who do you think is so much better for her? She looked at him with a cold gaze, as if she was enjoying his pain. Someone who knows how to do business, who knows how to gain and maintain power. Unlike you, John. Someone who will help you rise, not keep you stuck in a mediocre life. The revelation hit John like an electric shock. He always knew that Mary's mother had strong opinions, that she didn't view him with the same enthusiasm as Mary, but he never imagined that she would be capable of orchestrating something like this. And does Mary know? Does she know you're manipulating her life like this? He asked, trying to find some trace of regret on the face of the woman in front of him. Of course she knows. She always knew, replied the mother-in-law, smiling. But she needed a push. And I gave that push. John felt a wave of nausea. His entire marriage, every moment he thought was real, now seemed like a lie, a construct created to satisfy someone else's ambitions. So that was it, he murmured, more to himself than to her. It was that all along. Was I just a pawn in this game? That's what you never understood, John, she said, standing up and approaching him. Everything is a game. And you lost. He sat there, taking in everything he had heard, the pieces finally falling into place in his mind. Mary's behavior, the distance, the excuses, it all made sense now. She wasn't just cheating, she was being manipulated, and not by any lover, but by her own mother. He stood up, still dazed, but now with a clarity he hadn't had before. I won't let you destroy my life, he said, with a firmness that surprised even himself. No matter what you have planned, I will not come out of this defeated. She smiled, a smile that had nothing warm about it. We'll see, John. We'll see. As he left the house, he felt an anger rise within him, an anger that hadn't been there before. He knew he could no longer trust Mary, but now he understood that the problem went far beyond her. And somehow that made everything clearer. There was a game being played, and he finally knew who all the players were. But the question that remained was, how would he turn the tide in his favor? John left his mother-in-law's house with a feeling of unreality, as if he had just emerged from a nightmare that seemed to have no end. Her words echoed in his mind, bringing a mixture of anger and despair that he had never felt before. He always believed that marriage problems could be resolved with patience, dialogue and love, but now, he knew he was facing something much bigger. It wasn't just Mary. It was a whole scheme, a plot that had been carefully put together by someone he would never have imagined was capable of such cruelty. When he got into the car, John closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He needed to think, needed to decide what to do. Confronting Mary directly still didn't seem like the right choice, not after everything he had just discovered. He knew he needed time to plan, to understand what his options were. But the simple fact that her mother was manipulating her life and her marriage made her blood boil with outrage. He drove aimlessly for a while, trying to collect his thoughts. When he finally parked, he was in front of the gallery where Mary used to work. The building was closed, but the lights in Mary's studio were still on. John hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should go inside or just go home and wait until his emotions calmed down. But he knew he couldn't run from the truth any longer. He needed to see Mary, he needed to hear the truth from her, even if it destroyed him. When he entered the studio, he found Mary with her back to him, leaning over a screen. She didn't hear him enter, and John stood there for a moment, watching her, trying to understand how everything had gotten to this point. Finally, he cleared his throat, and she turned, surprised to see him there. John. What are you doing here? He asked, trying to smile, but he could see the tension in his eyes. We need to talk, Mary, he said, his voice firmer than he expected. And I want you to be honest with me this time. She frowned, confused, but something in his tone made her stop. John took a few steps forward, without taking his eyes off her. I went to see your mother, he continued, watching Mary's reaction. Her face went pale for a moment, and he knew he had touched a sensitive spot. She told me everything. Mary took a step back, as if she had been struck. Everything what? She tried to keep her voice steady, but there was a tremor she couldn't hide. I know about the plan, John said, cutting off any attempt at denial. I know she has been manipulating you to stay with me for convenience, and then, to cheat on me and end our marriage. I know she never wanted us to be together, and that from the beginning she was working to separate us. Mary opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the internal struggle between continuing to deny it or finally admitting the truth. This isn't how things were supposed to go, John, she said finally, her voice low, almost a whisper. I didn't want it to be like this. But it was, he countered, his voice filled with suppressed pain. I just want to understand, Mary. Why did you allow her to control you like this? Why did you destroy everything we had? She looked away, as if it were difficult to face him at that moment. Because I was lost, she confessed, and her voice broke. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. Everything I did felt wrong, and the only person who offered me a way out was her. She always said that she knew what was best for me, that if I followed what she planned, I could have a life that I truly deserved. And I believed her. John felt a mix of anger and pity. He always knew that Mary's mother had an influence over her, but he never imagined it would be to the point of manipulating her most intimate decisions. And the man I saw you with, he continued, trying to remain calm. He's part of it too, isn't he? Mary hesitated, but then nodded slowly. He is one of the partners in the company with whom my mother is trying to close a big contract. She said it would be beneficial if I cultivated a relationship with him. The words came out with difficulty, as if each syllable hurt her. She said that if everything worked out, we could get out of this financial situation and I could finally have the life she always dreamed of for me. John stared at her in disbelief. So, that was it? Was this all just a game to get a business contract? Our life together, everything we built, meant nothing. Mary looked at him, and for the first time, tears began to fill her eyes. It meant, John. It meant a lot to me. But I was lost, and I no longer knew how to find my way back to you. I was scared, and for a moment I thought my mother was right. John wanted to believe her, desperately wanted to find a reason to forgive her, to understand how everything had gone so wrong. But her every word sounded like a flimsy excuse for something that was unforgivable. What now, Mary? He asked, his voice a mix of sadness and resignation. What do you want me to do? She approached him, trying to touch his hand, but he backed away. I want to try to fix this, John. I want to try to find a way to get things back to the way they were. He shook his head, not knowing whether to laugh or cry at that. There's no going back, Mary. Everything we had was destroyed, and now I see it was never just about the two of us. There was always someone else, there was always something in the shadows that I couldn't see. Mary began to cry, but John could find no compassion to comfort her. I need time, he said, feeling the pain begin to transform into something stronger, more determined. I need to understand what I'm going to do now, because the life I thought I had doesn't exist anymore. He walked away, without looking back. The image of Mary crying, alone in the studio, was a scene he never imagined he would see, but now it was burned into his mind. As he walked outside, he knew the next step would be the hardest. He had discovered the betrayal, but there was still a bigger plot, a game of manipulation and power that he needed to dismantle. And for that, he would have to go much further than he was prepared for. But for the first time in a long time, John felt like he finally had something he could fight against. The truth had been revealed, and now he knew exactly who he was fighting. John knew he had reached the point where he needed to make a choice. He could not continue to live in the shadow of others' betrayal, manipulation, and control over his life. There was something deeper and more perverse going on than just Mary's infidelity. He had painfully discovered that his mother-in-law was in charge of everything, orchestrating a plan that had turned his marriage into a game of convenience. And it burned him inside. In the following days, John decided to act with a clarity and coolness that he had never shown before. He gathered all the evidence he could find, messages, photos and even recordings of conversations Mary had had with her mother. It wasn't easy. Each new discovery made him feel like he was stabbing himself over and over again, but he knew he needed to do this, not for revenge, but to regain control of his life. He couldn't be another piece on someone else's board. On a Saturday afternoon, he arranged to meet Mary and her mother-in-law at a restaurant. Mary reluctantly accepted after much insistence, and her mother, confident as ever, even seemed pleased to finally face John. When they arrived, John was calm, but there was a cold determination in his eyes that made Mary shudder as soon as she saw him. "I called you here to settle this once and for all," John began bluntly. "I want you to know that I know everything. The manipulation, the games, the betrayal, and it all ends today." John's mother-in-law smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're exaggerating, John. Things aren't that simple." "No, they're not simple," he replied, pulling an envelope from his briefcase and placing it on the table. "But the consequences will be." He looked directly at Mary, whose nervous expression was now turning to one of dread. "You said you wanted to try to make things right. I'm going to give you a chance to get out of this, but you need to be honest. You need to admit what happened, and I want to hear from you, in front of your mother, why all this happened." Mary hesitated, her hands shaking as she held the napkin, trying to find the courage to speak. She knew that everything she said there could define what would happen next, but she also knew that her mother was watching, evaluating every word. I was weak," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I let my mother convince me that you weren't enough for me, that I needed more, and I believed it. I thought she knew best." Mary's mother interrupted angrily. "Because I knew it, Mary. And I still know it. Look where he brought us. There is no future with a man who doesn't understand how the world works, who doesn't know how to take advantage of opportunities." "Enough," John cut in, looking directly at his mother-in-law. "I understand now that you will never change. That all that matters to you is control and power, even if it destroys your own daughter's life. And you, Mary," he turned to his wife, "you allowed this. You let someone play for you and destroyed everything we had." Silence fell over the table for a long moment, until John spoke again, with a tone that was both calm and implacable. "I talked to a lawyer. And I know your mother has business dealings that aren't exactly clean. I have enough evidence to expose all of this, and I can drag you into the hole she dug, if that's what you want." Mary's mother turned pale, and for the first time, her expression showed panic. "You wouldn't dare," she whispered, almost breathless. "I would dare," said John, without hesitation. "And if it means ruining you, I will. But there is an alternative. Mary can confess to cheating and we can go through with the divorce. You will not interfere. If you accept, I will forget everything I know about your business and no one will need to know. Otherwise, well, I don't think your partners will like knowing that you're using companies to launder money." Mary looked at her mother, who now seemed lost, unable to find a way out of the situation she always thought she could control. "Mother," said Mary, in a tone that was both sad and resigned. "I can't go on like this anymore. John, he's right. I need to break out of this cycle, and if you can't support me, then I'll have to do it alone." John watched as Mary finally made the choice he had hoped for, even if it meant the end of any chance of reconciliation between them. She looked at him, tears streaming down her face, but with a resolve he had never seen before. "I'm going to sign the papers, John. I'm going to accept the divorce. I just hope that one day you can forgive me." He took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. "Maybe I'll forgive. But I'll never forget." Mary's mother stood up abruptly, her chair squeaking on the marble floor. "You're making a mistake, Mary," she said, with a hard look, before turning to John. "And you aren't going to get away with this so easily." But John ignored her, turning to Mary for the last time. "I wish you find peace, even if I can't be by your side." And so, he stood up, walking out of the restaurant and leaving behind a life that had been built on lies and manipulation. John knew he wouldn't come out unscathed, but he finally felt free to move on, without the chains that tied him to a love that no longer existed. Mary, for her part, knew she had lost more than a husband. She had lost herself in an attempt to please someone who never had her best interests at heart. Her mother was finally left alone, the matriarch who once controlled every movement around her, now left without allies, her authority slipping away like sand through her fingers. Did you like the story? Leave your opinion in the comments. We want to know what you thought and if you could identify with any of the characters. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remembering that here, we do not support any type of betrayal. The stories are fiction, but they serve to show how dishonesty in lies can destroy lives. Stay tuned for more impactful stories.